Teho wiped the sweat from his face as he looked at the scanner readings again. The numbers were too good to be true, but his old ship never lied. About energy signatures, something big was floating out there in the asteroid field, something that would make him rich if he could get to it first. His salvage ship was nothing special, just a beat-up freighter he had bought with his life savings 3 years ago. The hull had more patches than original metal, and the engines made sounds that would scare most pilots, but Teho knew every bolt and wire in that ship, and she had never let him down when it mattered most. People in the galaxy thought humans were good for only two things: dangerous jobs and heavy lifting. The other species looked down on them like they were just smart animals who could follow orders. Teho did not mind this reputation much. It meant fewer competitors when he was hunting for scrap metal in places where smarter species were too scared to go the asteroid field. Around the dead planet was one of those places. Ships had been fighting battles here for thousands of years, leaving behind enough wreckage to keep a scavenger busy for decades. The problem was that most of the easy pickings were already gone. What remained was either too dangerous to reach or buried so deep in the rocks that it would take weeks to dig out. But the energy readings on his scanner were coming from something different. This was not just another piece of battlefield debris. The signature was steady and strong, like a ship that still had power after all these years. Most vessels lost their energy within days of being abandoned. This one had been keeping its systems running for who knew how long. Teho checked his weapons and suit seals before heading deeper into the asteroid field. He had learned the hard way that anything valuable enough to fight over was usually guarded by something that did not want visitors. His plasma rifle was old but reliable, and his environmental suit would keep him alive in vacuum for 6 hours. That should be enough time to get in, grab what he could, and get out before any pirates showed up. The source of the energy readings turned out to be the biggest ship Teho had ever seen in person. It was at least 2 kilometers long, with a design unlike anything he had studied in his salvage training manuals. The hull was covered in strange crystal formations that seemed to pulse with their own light, and the metal underneath had a color that shifted between silver and blue depending on how the light hit it. Most species would have taken one look at something so obviously alien and dangerous and decided to find easier prey somewhere else, but humans had a reputation for being too stubborn or too stupid to know when they were outclassed. Teho preferred to think of it as being thorough. He had not come this far just to turn around because a ship looked scary. His docking clamps barely fit the alien hull, but they held long enough for him to cycle the airlock and step aboard. The corridors were wide enough for beings much taller than humans, and the walls seemed to glow with a soft light that had no visible source. Everything was clean and perfectly preserved, as if the ship had been abandoned yesterday instead of centuries ago, but it had definitely been abandoned. The bodies were everywhere. They were beautiful in a way that made Teho feel crude and clumsy just looking at them, tall and graceful with features that seemed carved from ivory. Their limbs were longer than human proportions, but perfectly balanced. Each one wore robes that still shimmered with color, even though their owners had been dead for who knew how long. Whatever had killed them had been quick and efficient. Some bodies showed signs of energy weapon burns, while others seemed to have simply fallen where they stood. There were no signs of a struggle, no blast marks on the walls or debris from explosions. It was as if death had walked through the ship and touched each inhabitant once before moving on. Teho made his way deeper into the vessel, following corridors that seemed to pulse with life. Even though everyone aboard was dead, the technology was beyond anything he had ever seen. Walls that responded to his presence with gentle lights, panels that activated when he approached, showing symbols that meant nothing to him, but somehow felt important. The ship had areas that seemed designed for different purposes. Some chambers were clearly living quarters with furniture sized for the tall beings he had found throughout the ship. Others looked like workspaces filled with devices that hummed with power when he got close. But there was one section that felt different from all the rest. The corridor leading to the ship's center was wider than the others, and the walls were covered in crystal formations that grew more elaborate as he walked. The light grew brighter with each step, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. When he finally reached the central chamber, Teho had to stop and stare. The room was huge, with a ceiling that stretched up into darkness. The walls were covered in crystals that cast rainbow patterns across everything, and in the center of the room was something that made all the technology he had seen so far look simple. A massive crystal formation rose from the floor like a tree made of living light, and nestled in its branches was a figure that was definitely still alive. She was small, much smaller than the bodies he had found throughout the ship. No taller than a human child, but with the same graceful features as the others. Her hair was white as starlight, and her eyes were the deep blue of space between stars. When she saw Teho, she did not run or try to hide. Instead, she looked at him with an expression of relief so profound that it made his chest tight. Spoke in perfect galactic standard, her voice clear and sweet like music. "My protector has come. I knew the ship would find someone who could help me. I have been waiting so long for you to arrive." Taiho stared at her in confusion. He was just a scrap hunter looking for valuable metal to sell, not anyone's protector. But before he could explain the mistake, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. The crystal formations flashed red, and the gentle humming of the technology became an urgent warning tone through the transparent walls of the chamber. Teho could see ships approaching from multiple directions. Sleek black vessels that moved with military precision, their hulls marked with symbols that looked like clawed hands. Reaching across stars, he had never seen ships like these before, but he knew trouble when it was coming straight at him. The little being in the crystal formation looked at him with eyes that held centuries of sadness and spoke words that would change his life forever. "My people called me Hyjin, and I am the last queen of the Celestial Empire. The ones who destroyed my world have found me again, but the ship has chosen you to be my guardian. Will you help me escape before they kill us both?" Teho looked at the approaching warships, then back at the child who claimed to be a queen. He had come looking for scrap metal and instead found himself in the middle of something that was way above his pay grade. But when Hyjin reached out her small hand toward him, there was really only one choice he could make. He reached back and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers and the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. "Hold on tight, little queen," he said as the first enemy weapons began to fire. "We are getting out of here." The enemy ships opened fire before Teho could even think about running. Their weapons were different from anything he had seen before, shooting beams of purple light that made the ancient ship shake, but did not punch holes in the hull. They wanted to disable the vessel, not destroy it, which meant they wanted something inside. Olivia Jin pressed her small hands against the crystal formation, and suddenly the dead ship came to life. Lights blazed throughout the corridors, and the humming of machinery grew louder. The little queen was somehow talking to the ship itself, making systems work that had been sleeping for centuries, but Teho could see the effort was draining her. She was just a child trying to control technology beyond imagination. "We need to get to the engine room," she said, her voice strained from concentration. "The ship will protect us, but only if we can reach hyperspace before they break through the shields. My people built this vessel to run from exactly this kind of danger. But it needs someone to guide." Teho had never piloted anything bigger than his salvage ship, but he had spent years dodging pirates and customs officers. He knew how to think fast when death was breathing down his neck. Scooping Hyjin up in his arms, he ran through corridors that were changing around them as the ship rebuilt itself. The crystal formations were growing larger, and the walls were sealing breaches that had been open for centuries. The engine room was a cathedral of living light with crystals that stretched from floor to ceiling like frozen lightning. The main control console was clearly designed for beings much taller than humans, but when Hyjin touched it, the entire interface reformed itself to match their size. The symbols changed to ones that Teho could somehow understand, even though he had never seen them before. "The ship is teaching us," she explained as her fingers danced over controls that appeared wherever she needed them. "It knows we are not my people, but it will adapt. My royal blood tells it we are friends. The engines are coming online, but we only have seconds before those ships break through our defenses." Teho felt the ancient vessel shudder as enemy weapons found weak spots in the shield. The purple beams were getting stronger, and the ship was starting to take real damage. He could hear metal groaning and crystals cracking under the assault. Outside the viewports, he could see more enemy ships arriving. Their black hulls looked like wounds in space itself. Just as the shields failed completely, Hyjin slammed her hand down on what Teho hoped was the hyperspace control. The universe twisted around them, and suddenly they were somewhere else entirely. The enemy ships were gone, replaced by empty space and distant stars that looked nothing like the ones they had left behind. They had escaped, but barely. The ancient ship was dying around them. Power levels were dropping and the beautiful crystal formations were growing. The effort of jumping to hyperspace with damaged systems had pushed the vessel beyond its limits. They might have a few days before life support failed completely, maybe less if the engines gave out first. Jin collapsed in the pilot's chair, looking even smaller and more fragile than before. Using her abilities to control the ship had exhausted her, but she was trying hard not to show it. When she looked at Taeho, her eyes held a wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. My people were the rulers of 1,000 worlds, she said quietly. We had an empire that lasted for millions of years. Our technology could reshape matter itself, and our ships could cross the galaxy in days, but we made enemies of those who believed. Strength was the only thing that mattered. The Dominion came from the dark spaces between galaxies, bringing with them a hunger that could never be satisfied. They destroyed worlds not to conquer them, but to prove they could. They turned our own subjects against us with promises of power, and when our fleets met theirs in battle, they used weapons that fed on the very life force of our ship. Taeho listened as she told him about the war that had destroyed her people. The Dominion did not fight like civilized beings. They used fear as a weapon, turning allies against each other and making surrender seem like the only rational choice. When they finally reached the heart of the Celestial Empire, they did not just conquer it, they erased it from existence itself. I was hidden away on this ship. When the end came, she continued. Her voice was steady, but Taeho could see tears in her eyes. My caretakers put me in the crystal chamber and programmed the ship to find someone who could protect me. They died believing that someday their queen would return to rebuild what was lost. The ship was moving through hyperspace, but Taeho had no idea where they were going. Hyjin had set a course for something called the Kepler Void, a region of space that most pilots avoided because ships that went there had a habit of disappearing. She explained that her people had built secret bases in dangerous places, exactly so they could hide from enemies like the Dominion. As they traveled deeper into unknown space, Taeho began to understand just how different Hyjin was from any being he had ever met. She could make the ship's systems work better just by concentrating on them. When she was hungry, the food processors created meals that tasted better than anything he had eaten in years. When she was scared, the lights grew brighter and the temperature rose to something more comfortable, but she was still a child in many ways. She had nightmares about watching her world burn and would only sleep if Taeho stayed nearby to keep watch. She had started calling him Appa, which she explained meant father in the old language of her people. The word made something warm spread through his chest, even though he had never thought about having children. During their journey through hyperspace, Hyjin taught him about the galaxy beyond human space. There were species with technology that made human science look like children playing with rocks, beings who could live for thousands of years, and others who existed as pure energy. There were empires that spanned entire galactic arms and traders who bought and sold solar systems like commodities, but the Dominion had changed everything. They had appeared from the void between galaxies, bringing with them a philosophy that saw all other life as weakness to be eliminated. Their expansion had consumed hundreds of civilizations, and their fleets grew stronger with each victory. The few species that remained free were too scared to fight back and too scattered to organize any real resistance. The Kepler Void was everything the story said it would be. Space itself seemed twisted here, with stars that flickered in and out of existence and nebulae that formed impossible shapes. When their ship finally dropped out of hyperspace, Taeho saw something that made him question his own sanity. A planet was floating alone in the darkness with no star to warm it. But somehow it was covered in light, cities and installations that stretched across continents, all powered by energy sources. He could not identify the planet was artificial, he realized, built by beings who could reshape matter itself into whatever they needed. But as they approached the hidden world, alarms began sounding again. Enemy ships were already there waiting for them. The Dominion had somehow followed them through hyperspace, and now they were trapped between the planet and a fleet that outnumbered them 100 to 1. Hyjin looked at Taeho with eyes that held no fear, only determination. They want to capture me alive, she said. which means they will try not to destroy this ship. That gives us an advantage they do not expect. The base below has defenses my people built to last forever. If we can reach it, we might have a chance. Teho gripped the controls of the ancient ship and prepared to run the most dangerous gauntlet of his life. He was just a scrap hunter who had stumbled into something far bigger than himself, but the little queen beside him was counting on him, and that was enough to make him brave. The run to the hidden planet was the longest few minutes of Teho's life. Enemy ships surrounded them on all sides, firing those purple beams that were designed to disable rather than destroy, but the ancient vessel had one last surprise left in its dying systems. When Hyjin touched the weapons console, the ship revealed guns that had been hidden in the crystal formations along its hull. The weapons were like nothing Teho had ever seen. They fired beams of pure white light that cut through enemy shields like they were made of paper. 3 Dominion ships exploded before the others realized what they were facing. The rest pulled back to regroup, giving the ancient ship just enough time to reach the planet's atmosphere. The base had shields that snapped on the moment they entered the atmosphere, creating a protective bubble around the landing site. But Teho could see that the shields were under heavy attack from the Dominion fleet above. Purple beams hammered the energy barrier, making it flicker and spark. The defenses were strong, but they would not hold forever against so many ships inside the base. They found exactly what Hyjin had hoped for, but not in the way she had expected. The facility was huge, with corridors that stretched for kilometers and chambers large enough to hold entire fleets of ships, but most of the beings living there were not her people at all. They were refugees from dozens of different species, all hiding from the same enemy. Manho was the first to greet them, a small being with 4 arms and skin that changed color depending on his mood. His people had been famous throughout the galaxy for their engineering skills before the Dominion wiped out their homeworld. He had been keeping the base running for years, using spare parts and clever repairs that would have impressed even human Mechanixujin was different entirely. She was tall and covered in scales that looked like armor, her people having been warriors before they became refugees. When the Dominion conquered her world, she had led the resistance until there was no one left to lead. Now she commanded the base's defenses with the same skill that had once made her enemies fear her name. There were others, 2 beings from species Teho had never heard of, all with the same story. The Dominion had come to their worlds with promises of peace and prosperity. Anyone who believed them became slaves. Anyone who resisted was destroyed. The lucky few who escaped had found their way to bases like this one, where they could hide but never really live. When Hyjin revealed who she was, the reactions were mixed. Some of the refugees dropped to their knees in respect, recognizing the royal bloodline that had once protected their ancestors. Others were skeptical. She looked like a child, and her people's empire was just a memory now. What could one little girl do against the force that had conquered half the galaxy? But when the base's main power core began failing under the Dominion bombardment, Hyjin showed them what she could really do. She placed her hands on the massive crystal formation at the base's heart, and suddenly energy began flowing through systems that had been barely functional for years. The shields did not just stabilize. They grew stronger, and for the first time in days the enemy ships were forced to pull back. The refugees stared at their young queen with new understanding. She was not just a child with a fancy bloodline, she was the living key to technology that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. For the first time since their worlds had fallen, they began to feel something they had almost forgotten. Hope Hyjin called a meeting of all the base's leaders and proposed something that seemed impossible. Instead of just hiding and waiting for the Dominion to find them, they would fight back. Her people's empire had fallen because they tried to fight a conventional war against an enemy that did not follow conventional rules, but the Dominion had weaknesses that could be exploited. Their rapid expansion had left them controlling too much territory with too few loyal troops. Most of their forces were conscripts from conquered worlds who served only because they had no choice. If those conscripts could be shown that resistance was possible, that the Dominion could be beaten, then entire fleets might change sides. The plan was ambitious beyond belief. They would start small, liberating individual ships and outposts, building a network of resistance. Fighters who shared a common enemy, the refugees in the base, would form the core of this new alliance using their knowledge of Dominion tactics and technology to strike where the enemy was weak. Minho was excited by the technical challenges. The Dominion used the same basic technology across their entire empire, which meant that once you learned to hack one ship, you could hack them all. His forearms moved in complex patterns as he explained how they could turn the enemy's own weapons. Against them, Sujin was more cautious. She had fought the Dominion before and knew how dangerous they could be. But she also knew that the current strategy of hiding and hoping was doomed to failure. Eventually, the Dominion would find every base, every refugee, every reminder that they had not completely won. If they were going to die anyway, they might as well die fighting. Other species representatives had their own concerns and ideas. Some wanted to focus on rescuing prisoners from Dominion labor camps. Others thought they should target the enemy's supply lines. The debate went on for hours, with each group convinced that their approach was the most important. Ho found himself in the strange position of being asked for his opinion, as if his thoughts mattered as much as those of military commanders and technical experts. He was just a human scrap hunter who had stumbled into this situation by accident, but Haijin trusted him completely, and her trust gave his words weight. With the others, he suggested they do all of it: rescue operations to build their numbers, supply raids to get equipment they needed, and propaganda broadcasts to spread word that the resistance was real. The key was to make the Dominion react to them, instead of the other way around, force the enemy to spread their forces thin, trying to protect everything instead of concentrating on conquest. The debate ended when Haijin stood up and made her decision. As queen, they would try Tehozia approach. Starting with small operations and building up to larger ones, she appointed him as her chief advisor and bodyguard. Despite his complete lack of formal military training, his experience as a scavenger had taught him to think creatively and take calculated risk, skills that translated surprisingly well to guerrilla warfare. More importantly, she trusted him, and her trust was something the other refugees could understand. When she called him Apa in front of the assembled resistance, it was not just affection anymore. It was a statement that this human was family to their queen and therefore someone they could follow. The first target was chosen within hours: a Dominion supply convoy carrying weapons and prisoners to a newly conquered world. The convoy was heavily guarded, but it followed a predictable route through hyperspace. Minho could provide technical support to disable their shields. Sujin would plan the tactical approach, and Teho would lead the boarding parties using techniques he had learned raiding pirate bases. As the meeting broke up and the various species began preparing for their first joint operation, Haijin pulled Teho aside. She looked tired from using her abilities to strengthen the base, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing in me when even I was not sure I could do this. My people chose you to be my protector, but you have become so much more. You have become the father I needed when everything else was taken away." Toho felt that warm feeling in his chest again, stronger than before. He had come looking for scrap metal, and instead found a family among the stars. It was not the life he had planned, but as he looked around at the refugees preparing to fight back against impossible odds, he realized it was exactly the life he wanted. The supply convoy was exactly where Minhozia intelligence said it would be, moving through the asteroid field that marked the border between free space and Dominion territory. 12 ships in total, including 4 heavy transports and 8 escort vessels. The escorts were newer models with shields and weapons that could tear apart most civilian ships, but they were not expecting an attack from multiple directions. Teho floated in his environmental suit among the asteroids, watching the convoy approach. His small team was hidden throughout the field, each one waiting for his signal. The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in practice. They would disable the escorts, capture the transports, and rescue any prisoners before Dominion reinforcements could arrive. Haijin had insisted on coming despite every argument Teho could make about it being too dangerous. She was supposed to stay on their command ship safely away from the fighting, but he should have known she would not listen to that part of the plan. The little queen had a habit of doing exactly what she thought was right, regardless of what anyone else wanted. The first part of the attack went perfectly. Minhozia technical expertise allowed them to plant devices on the convoy ships that would disable their shields without triggering distress beacons. The Dominion crews never knew what hit them. One moment their shields were at full strength, the next they were sitting helpless in space, while resistance fighters swarmed over their Hulsujin's tactical planning proved its worth as the escort ships found themselves surrounded and outgunned. The Dominion had trained their crews to fight in formation using overwhelming firepower to crush enemies, but they had never faced an enemy that attacked from inside asteroid fields using the rocks themselves as weapons and cover. 3 escort ships surrendered immediately when they realized they were trapped. The other 5 tried to fight their way out, but the resistance had prepared for that possibility. Hidden among the asteroids were weapon platforms that Minho had built from salvaged Dominion equipment. When the enemy ships tried to run, they found themselves flying into crossfire that tore their hulls apart. The real prize was in the transport ships. Weapons and supplies worth millions of credits, food and medical equipment for newly conquered worlds, and most importantly, prison ships carrying beings who had been captured during the latest Dominion expansion. Each transport held hundreds of prisoners crammed into cargo holds with barely enough life support to keep them alive. Tejo led the boarding party that took the first prison ship, and what he found there made him angrier than he had ever been in his life. The prisoners were from dozens of different species, including many children who had been taken from their families to be raised as Dominion soldiers. The conditions were horrible, with beings dying from disease and starvation, while their captors ignored their suffering. That was when Hyjin appeared beside him, having somehow gotten from the command ship to the prison transport without anyone noticing. When she saw the conditions inside the cargo hold, something changed in her. The young queen, who had seemed so fragile and dependent on Tejo's protection, revealed the iron will that had made her people an empire. She placed her hands on the ship systems, and suddenly the life support improved. The lights grew brighter, and the temperature rose to something bearable. Then she began speaking to the prisoners in languages Tejo had never heard. Each group hearing her words in their own tongue, she told them who she was and promised that their suffering was over. The effect was immediate. Prisoners who had been too weak to stand found strength they did not know they had. Beings who had given up hope began to believe in freedom again. Even the guards who had been treating them so cruelly seemed confused and frightened, as if they were seeing their captives as real people for the first time working together. Hyjin and Tejo led the rescue operation that freed over 1,000 prisoners from the 4 transport ships. Many were too weak to fight, but they brought something more valuable than weapons. They brought intelligence about Dominion operations, troop movements, and the locations of other prison ships. More importantly, word of the rescue began to spread through the galaxy's underground networks. For the first time since the war began, people were talking about hope instead of just survival. The Lost Queen had returned, and she was not hiding in some distant safe place. She was fighting alongside the people who needed her most. The Dominion response was swift and brutal. They began executing prisoners on other transport ships rather than risk more rescues. Security around their supply lines was increased, and bounties were placed on the heads of the resistance leaders. The bounty on Tejo was particularly high, with the Dominion apparently unable to believe that a human could be effectively leading military operations against them. But the bounties had an unexpected effect throughout human space. Humans had always been underestimated by other species, treated as useful for dangerous work, but not much else. The idea that one of their own was causing the mighty Dominion enough trouble to warrant a massive bounty was a source of intense pride. Hyjin was the first human to contact the resistance after hearing about the bounties. He was a ship captain with connections throughout the Outer Rim and a network of contacts who could move people and equipment through space lanes. The Dominion could not monitor. His first message was simple: if you need help moving supplies or people, I know every smuggler and trader from here to the galactic Korjungsu. Followed a few days later. He was a former human military officer who had been dismissed by his alien superiors as unfit for command. His record showed tactical brilliance, but his ideas had been ignored because he was human. When he heard that the resistance was actually listening to human strategies, he volunteered immediately. Soon there were dozens of human volunteers arriving at the hidden base. Merchants who donated supplies, mechanics who could repair any ship, pilots who knew routes through space that did not appear on any official star charts. Each one had heard the story of the human who had become father to an alien queen and wanted to be part of something that proved their species could be heroes. The resistance was growing faster than anyone had expected, but with growth came new challenges. Different species had different ideas about how to fight. The Dominion and old prejudices died hard even among people fighting for the same cause. Some groups wanted to focus on hit and run attacks, while others preferred direct confrontation. Jin found herself mediating disputes between representatives who had been enemies before the Dominion conquered them all. Her youth actually became an advantage in these situations. She could speak to different groups without the baggage of historical conflicts between their species. What mattered was not who they had been before, but who they could become together. Tehozia's role was evolving too. He was still Hyjin's bodyguard and the person she trusted most, but he was also becoming a symbol to humans throughout the galaxy. Stories about the scrap hunter who had found a lost queen were spreading through space stations and colonies, inspiring others to believe that destiny was not determined by species or birth. The resistance scored several more victories during the following months, liberating prison ships, capturing Dominion supply convoys, and rescuing refugees from conquered worlds. Each success brought more volunteers and more resources, but it also attracted more attention from Dominion high command. Reports began reaching the resistance that elite Dominion units were being deployed specifically to hunt down the lost queen and her human protector. The enemy was no longer content to treat them as a minor nuisance. They were now considered a real threat to Dominion expansion, and that meant the full weight of their military machine would soon be brought to bear. As Teho prepared for the challenges ahead, he watched Hyjin work with the various resistance leaders and marveled at how much she had grown. The scared child he had found on that derelict ship was becoming a true queen, learning to balance the wisdom of her royal heritage with the practical experience of fighting alongside people from all walks of life. She still called him Uppa when she thought no one else was listening, and the words still made that warm feeling spread through his chest. But now he understood what it really meant. He was not just her protector or her advisor, he was proof that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that love was stronger than fear. The bounties on their heads had turned the resistance leaders into legends. Throughout human space, every cantina and trading post from the core worlds to the outer rim buzzed with stories about the human scrap hunter who had become bodyguard to an alien queen. Humans who had spent their lives being treated as second-class citizens suddenly had something to be proud of. One of their own was making the mighty Dominion Nervastohayan prove to be worth his weight in rare metals when it came to moving supplies and people through Dominion space. His network of smugglers, traders, and information brokers could get almost anything to almost anywhere without the enemy knowing about it within weeks. The resistance had supply lines that stretched across half the galaxy, hidden in the cargo holds of merchant ships and disguised as routine trade goods. Jiangsu was even more valuable once he was given a chance to show what human tactical thinking could accomplish. The other species had been fighting the Dominion using traditional military strategies, formations, and tactics that had worked for thousands of years. But Jiangsu understood that fighting a superior enemy required breaking all the rules. His first major operation was an attack on a Dominion fortress world that was supposed to be impossible to assault. The planet was protected by orbital defense platforms that could destroy entire fleets, and the surface was covered with military installations that could hold off an invasion. For years, most commanders would have needed a massive fleet to even attempt such an attack. Instead, Jiangsu used 3 cargo ships filled with mining equipment. The Dominion guards let them land without question, assuming they were slave workers being delivered to the planet's factories. Once on the surface, the cargo ships opened to reveal not mining gear, but strike teams equipped with captured Dominion weapons and equipment. The attack hit 12 different targets simultaneously, using the planet's own communication systems against them. By the time the Dominion command realized what was happening, the resistance teams had destroyed the main power grid, disabled the orbital defense platforms, and freed thousands of prisoners from the labor camps. The entire operation took less than 6 hours. Word of the victory spread like wildfire through the underground networks. Suddenly, every conquered world was wondering if liberation might be possible. The Dominion had seemed unstoppable But now they were losing battles to an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. The psychological impact was even more important than the military. One Hai-Jin was growing stronger with each passing day. Her abilities with the ancient technology were becoming more powerful, allowing her to interface with systems across multiple ships and installations simultaneously. But more importantly, she was learning to lead not just through royal authority, but through genuine care for the people who followed her. She made a point of visiting every refugee camp and resistance base, personally speaking with individuals about their losses, their hopes, and their fears. She remembered names and faces from dozens of different species and could discuss the specific problems facing each group. The beings who had started following her out of respect for her bloodline now followed her because they believed in her as a person. Resistance was scoring victories throughout Dominion space, but their success was also making them a target. Admiral Kongmin commanded the Dominion fleet that had destroyed Hai-Jin's homeworld, and he took the growing rebellion as a personal insult. He began deploying his best ships and most experienced crews specifically to hunt down what he called the Lost Princess and her pet Humanteho. Found himself commanding operations that involved hundreds of ships and thousands of fighters. His lack of formal military training actually became an advantage because he approached problems differently than traditionally trained officers would. The Dominion had prepared for conventional warfare, but they had no idea how to counter someone who thought like a scavenger. One of his most successful strategies was what he called the Magpie approach. Instead of trying to destroy Dominion ships outright, the Resistance would steal everything valuable and leave the hulks drifting in space. Weapon systems would be removed and installed on Resistance vessels. Cargo would be transferred to ships that needed supplies. Even the crew quarters would be stripped of anything useful. The psychological effect on Dominion forces was devastating. Crews would wake up to find their ships barely functional, with everything from their personal belongings to their emergency rations missing. The Dominion had trained their people to expect either victory or glorious death in battle. They had not prepared them for the humiliation of being picked clean like scavengers' prey. As the Resistance grew, it began attracting attention from unexpected sources. Several minor species that had remained neutral in the war started providing covert support. They could not openly oppose the Dominion, but they could make sure that Resistance supply convoys had safe harbor, or that important intelligence found its way to the right people. Even some Dominion officers began to question what they were fighting for. The propaganda had told them they were bringing order to chaos, but the Resistance was showing them something different. Here were beings from dozens of species working together without anyone being forced into submission. The contrast with Dominion methods was becoming harder to ignore. Hai-Jin established what she called the Council of Species, with representatives from every group that had joined the Resistance. Each species had an equal voice in deciding strategy, and resources were distributed based on need rather than military contribution. The council meetings were chaotic at first, with old grudges and cultural misunderstandings causing constant arguments, but gradually the different groups began to understand each other. The engineers shared technical knowledge that helped everyone build better ships and weapons. The warriors taught fighting techniques that could be adapted by different species. The traders provided information about Dominion supply routes and economic weaknesses. Taho often found himself serving as a mediator during these discussions. His outsider perspective as a human helped him see solutions that the other species missed. His reputation as Hai-Jin's chosen protector gave his words weight, but his humble background as a scrap hunter made him approachable to beings who might have been intimidated by traditional nobility. The Resistance achieved its greatest victory when they liberated an entire star system that the Dominion had been using as a staging area for further expansion. The operation required perfect coordination between dozens of different groups, with attacks happening simultaneously across multiple worlds. Zhang Su planned the military strategy, while Min Ho handled the technical aspects of disabling Dominion communications. Du Hyun coordinated the logistics of getting thousands of Resistance fighters into position without being detected, and Hai-Jin used her abilities to interface with the ancient defense platforms that her people's empire had left throughout the galaxy. When the attacks began, the Dominion Forces found themselves cut off from their command structure with their own weapons. Turning against them, entire fleets surrendered rather than fight battles they could not win. The star system that had been a symbol of Dominion power became the first territory officially liberated by the Resistance. The victory celebration lasted for days, with beings from hundreds of different worlds coming together to share food, music, and stories. But even as they celebrated, Tejo could see storm clouds gathering. The Dominion would not accept such a humiliating defeat without responding with overwhelming force. Admiral Kangmin was already assembling the largest fleet seen since the original conquest wars. Every available ship was being pulled from garrison duty and patrol routes to form an armada that could crush the Resistance once and for all. The message from Dominion High Command was clear: surrender immediately or watch every world that had joined the rebellion burn. He stood before the assembled Council of Species and spoke with a voice that carried the authority of her ancient bloodline and the wisdom she had gained fighting alongside them. She told them that the final battle was coming and that each species would have to choose whether to stand together or fall separately. The vote was unanimous. They would fight as one people, united not by conquest but by choice. When the Dominion came with their overwhelming force, they would find not a collection of scattered resistance groups, but a true alliance of free beings willing to die for the right to determine their own destiny. As the council meeting ended and the various species began preparing for what might be their last battle, Haijin found Tejo standing alone, looking out at the stars. She slipped her small hand into his, and for a moment they were just a father and daughter facing an uncertain future together. Tomorrow we find out if we have built something strong enough to survive, she said quietly. But no matter what happens, I want you to know that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You taught me that family is not about blood or species, but about the people who choose to love. Yudaho squeezed her hand gently, feeling the weight of all the choices that had brought them to this moment. He had started as a simple scrap hunter looking for valuable metal. Now he was helping to lead a galactic revolution. But the most important transformation was not in his circumstances, but in his heart. He had found a daughter among the stars, and she had made him a better person than he ever thought he could be. The Dominion fleet that emerged from hyperspace was larger than anything the galaxy had seen since the ancient wars that had shaped the current star map. Admiral Kangmin had assembled over 10,000 ships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts that could crack planets to swarms of fighters that blotted out the stars. The message was clear: this would be the final battle, and the Dominion intended to win it through overwhelming force. Tejo stood on the bridge of the Resistance flagship, watching the enemy formation deploy with military precision. Every ship knew exactly where it was supposed to be and what its role would be in the coming battle. The Dominion had turned warfare into a science with tactics and strategies refined over centuries of conquest. The Resistance fleet was much smaller, only 3,000 ships of various sizes and capabilities. But what they lacked in numbers they made up for in determination. Every vessel carried beings who had lost everything to the Dominion and were fighting for the chance to build something better. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. He stood beside Tejo, looking impossibly small and young to be commanding such a massive force, but when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of her royal bloodline and the confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before. Today we find out if the galaxy wants to be ruled by fear or inspired by hope, she said quietly. The battle began with Admiral Kangmin doing exactly what everyone expected. He ordered his massive ships to advance in perfect formation, using their superior firepower to overwhelm the Resistance defenses. It was the same strategy that had won 1,000 victories for the Dominion, and there was no reason to think it would fail now. But Haijin had been preparing for this moment since the day Tejo found her on that ancient ship. The technology of her people's empire was not just advanced, it was flexible in ways that even she was still discovering. As the Dominion fleet approached, she reached out with her mind and touched systems that had been sleeping throughout the galaxy for centuries. The first surprise came when derelict ships that had been drifting in the battlefield suddenly came to life. Ancient vessels from a dozen different civilizations powered up their weapons and began firing on the Dominion fleet. The enemy had planned for everything except fighting the combined ghosts of every empire. they had destroyed. Then the real shock began. Ships in the Dominion fleet started changing sides as Hyjin used her abilities to broadcast directly into the minds of every conscious being in the battle. The slaves and conscripts who made up most of the enemy crews heard their queen's voice promising freedom, while Dominion officers found their own doubts and fears amplified beyond. Enduransiteho watched in amazement as entire squadrons of enemy ships broke formation and turned their weapons on their former allies. The perfect military machine that Admiral Kangmin had assembled was falling apart as its own crews realized they were fighting for the wrong side. But the Admiral was not finished, yet his flagship was crewed entirely by Dominion loyalist beings who genuinely believed in their empire's mission of conquest. When he saw his fleet dissolving around him, Kangmin activated weapons that had been forbidden even during the original war. The planet killer beam lanced out from his dreadnought, aimed not at the resistance fleet but at the world below, where millions of refugees had gathered to watch the battle. The weapon could crack a planet's crust and boil away its atmosphere, killing everything on the surface in a matter of minutes. Hyjin screamed as she felt the weapon charging up. Every innocent life on the planet below was counting on her to protect them, but the planet killer was too powerful for even her abilities to stop. Once it fired, nothing could save the world and everyone on it. That was when Taeho did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He grabbed the controls of the flagship and sent it diving straight toward the enemy dreadnought. The resistance vessel was much smaller and